Now, we have a few categories of questions for you here. The first being character creation, which is the arguably most important part of the game because it's what you are playing as and whom you are playing as. So the first question is, compared to 5th edition D&D, what major differences are there in the character creation system?
Systematically, not a lot. It is very similar. You choose your race, but we don't have races, we have species. And you choose your class, and then you essentially follow the 5e system for creating a character. However, there are a number of, differences. One of which is that there are no racial ability modifiers. So whether you choose to be we have 6 races, which we call species. So you have humans, Martians, moonlings, robots, and then 2 species of Venusians fragilis and Venusians robustus. There are no ability score modifiers tied to that choice. However, once you decide what species you want to be, you will then choose what your home planet is, where you were raised. And it doesn't necessarily depend on the choice you've made for your species. I mean, this is the age of intergalactic travel, well, at least interplanetary travel. So there are plenty of humans on other planets, plenty of Martians on Venus, and robots on all over. So if you want to be a Venusian who was raised on Earth, great. If you want to be a Martian who was raised on an asteroid in the Kuiper Belt, great. But that's where the ability modifiers come in. So depending on where you were raised or spent the majority of your time before you embarked on your adventuring career, that's where you would have modifiers to strength, dex, and constitution, which reflect gravity differences and differences in atmosphere. But another twist on that is that those modifiers change depending on which setting you're in. So if you were born on Earth, no matter what species you are, if you're born on Earth, then you don't have any kind of modifiers when you're on Earth. If you go to the moon as someone born on Earth, you'll have a strength increase because the gravity is less, so you're stronger. You have a dexterity decrease because in zero gravity, it's just harder to manipulate things and utilize hand-eye coordination, all that. And not much of a constitution change. However, that same character that then travels to Venus, not much difference when it comes to strength and dex. Gravity is basically the same. However, Venus has a much different atmosphere, so your constitution modifier will be different. So you will be, as you're rocketing about, you potentially will have your ability scores change depending on where you are. Now, if that sounds annoying, like who wants to mess with their ability scores, there's plenty of equipment and acclimatization overwear that you can acquire that will allow you to negate those things. So if you have a pressurized and filterized suit or helmet, then you can negate constitution stuff. And if you're wearing a powered armor, you can negate the strength stuff. So we hope it won't feel too fiddly. We think it's fun and interesting, and playtesting, people have enjoyed the fact that, wow, I was really strong in this setting, and suddenly I'm actually a little more dexterous, but I can't carry as much. And then obviously the constitution bits for the different pathogens in the atmosphere. So that's one thing that's different about character creation. Now, once you've decided on your species and your home planet, and then the next thing you do is choose a class. And we have all of the 12 classes from 5th edition, but they've all been updated, and some more so than others, or I guess overhauled, but some more so than others. Some, like fighter, which are called rayguns, clerics, which are called evangelical engineers, or rogues, which are called scapegraces. They're mostly reskins. We provide, there's a new name for the class if you want to use it, and there's also some advice for how to adapt other concepts for that particular class. But mostly it's a reskin. It's pretty simple. So for those people who know 5e and want to just pick up and start blasting away as soon as possible, the majority, I think 7 or 8 of the 12 are basic reskins. However, there are a handful of classes which underwent pretty significant overhauls. For example, the druids in this setting are called anatomalies. So these are characters who channel phlogiston from the atmosphere into their bodies. And that's how their druidic powers are, and spellcasting and spell-like abilities, that's how they're powered. They take these syringes and stick them in themselves. So they're really kind of these weird experimenters with really poorly tested, strange substances from the atmosphere. And they're sticking that stuff into their body in order to do things like cast Thorn Whip and obviously to shapeshift. Shapeshifting also requires them to expose themselves to electricity. They have to basically tase themselves in order to shapeshift. So there are, as you can imagine, some rule changes in terms of how all of that works. But even for those, like the druid, the monk is called an automonastic, and only robots can be those. Automonastics are robots that were designed to do one thing, like move this box over here or be a toaster or whatever, who have come online, who have woken up, who become self-aware, and they are automonastics, and they have all the monk powers. It's not key powers, it's your Flago battery that charges your monk powers. But even for those that underwent a significant kind of overhaul, all of the mechanics are really the same in terms of spell casting, your spell attack modifier, your spell save DC, the spells you can cast and the damage they do and how they work. All of that is the same. It's just how some of that stuff works and how it's explained is different, but a bit more than a reskin, I'd say, for several of them. And then we also have 20 new backgrounds as well that are kind of Dr. G specific. And then the last thing, which I imagine we're going to get into a little bit in more detail later, has to do with magic, and the fact that there is no magic here. So how in the world do you cast magic? And the simple answer is you have to use technology. So you have to have a certain kind of equipment, which is called a gadgetronic. And gadgetronics channel phlogiston from the atmosphere to create marvelous effects, marvelous scientific effects, i.e. spells. And I'm sure we'll get into how all of that works later. But in terms of actual character creation, it's all pretty, it should feel very, very familiar to 5e players. In some cases, just reskinned, in some cases, overhauled. And all of that should be supported by the custom character sheet that we've created too, that kind of maps out for you what each of the things in our game or our setting, how it corresponds to 5e, and has spaces for you to record your ability score modifications for each of the 4 major planets and so forth.
Well, that answered quite a few questions at once. Let me double back to get some details from the earlier ones. Now, you talked about the 4 other non-humans at work here, the Martians, the Moonlings, and the 2 kinds of Venusians. Would you mind explaining a bit more about those?
And robots.
And robots, but robots are the underpinnings of every good modern society.
Right, except when they go crazy and strangle people. But you know, that's rare. And of course, then there's Robot Planet, that great menace up in the sky that is portaling robots into people's homes. But that's maybe for another discussion. So yeah, let's see. Starting with your old nemesis, the Venusians. So Venusians come in 2 types: the Venusian robustus and Venusian fragilis, and they are they look fairly similar, but they can be any class except for automonastics, which you have to be a robot to be that. And the situation in Venus, as you well know, is a bit untenable at the moment. Venusians have not capitulated to English overlordship, as did the Moonlings and as did the Martians through just their general ennui. But on Venus, it's a whole different story. They're fighting back effectively.
Really is just poor sportsmanship when you get down to it.
Yeah, they for some reason are somewhat averse to the idea of taking on the benevolent yoke of English overlordship. Go figure. But Venusians have now traveled to other planets as well, so they can be found on any of the other settings or any of the other planets that we've specifically defined. But there's much more to the universe than just the 4 major settings in this supplement. What else about Venusians would you want to know?
What is the marked difference between the robustus and the fragilis?
It's mostly aesthetic. The robustus are brawny-looking folks, and the fragilis are much scrawnier. But they both of which have the kind of tentacles for mouths, and but roughly human size and shape. Generally greenish to grayish skin, 3 fingers, but otherwise they are just like humans, just like Martians, just like everybody else. It doesn't. Fragilis aren't naturally less strong than robustus. It just depends on what their home planet is, where they grew up, in terms of ability score modifiers anyway.
Fair enough. Now, for the classes that you mentioned, as many were altered, are there any brand new ones added in, or were you just keeping to the core?
Keeping to the core, as it were. So we have the 12 from 5e, but as I said, several will feel very different. The Bard, for example, is called an Omediate, and we have kind of 2 schools of Omediates. There's the performing arts, which is kind of the more traditional Bard, the dancers, the singers, but also we've expanded that to include things like sculptors and painters, and they use their Bard-like abilities by using technology to kind of weaponize their abilities. So a painter might have a particular gadgetronic, which is a kind of mini canvas with a projector on it, and they might paint up something in the middle of a battle and project it into the eyeballs of their opponent and have some effect on that, or paint up something and project it around to their friends and give them their Bard-like buffs and stuff.
Psychological warfare at its finest.
At its finest, and artistic warfare as well. And then you have the media, which is the other school of Omediates or Bards, and this is the Associated Press. These are the reporters and the journalists, the caricaturists, and the wartime photographers who are out there in the field covering what's going on other planets. And it's particularly important for this setting because control of the media is extremely important. For example, on Earth and also on the Moon, Dr. Grordbort himself has almost complete control over the media. And so what's actually happening on places like Mars and Venus is not really reflected in the newspapers of the day back on Earth. However, there are underground presses on Earth and elsewhere that are trying to kind of tell the true story about what's going on and what kind of horrors are being committed by the British Empire as they're attempting to subjugate these other peoples. And in that sense, the Omediates who specialize in the media can begin to have an effect on that. But likewise, Omediates from other planets, like a Martian Omediate from the press, can likewise influence how people think of Earth back on Mars and otherwise. So something like a Bard will probably feel quite a bit different. I mean, you could still play a lute strumming guy if you want, but there's a lot of enough nuance that I think it will feel in some ways like a kind of a new class.
Very good indeed. Now for the main 6 attributes, I assume it's still strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Those are unchanged, but have their applications been changed? Because in the past, intelligence is only really used for wizardy types, but with the advent of technology, I assume intelligence is much more prevalent.
Right. Well, that's a great question. I think one of the main ways that the ability scores are used slightly differently has to do with how you interact with technology. So we have 8 types of technology in this setting, And each of the classes interacts with technology in a different way, and in many cases using different attributes. I mean, if you're a fighter and you want to use a Thompson 4000 heavy ray weapon, you're still using strength. I mean, it's a ranged weapon, but it's really not about how well you can aim. It's about being able to hold your ground while you fire this gigantic weapon. So, and likewise, if you're a wizard, a boffin, then you're using your intelligence. If you're a sorcerer, you're using your charisma and so forth. So it's all of that is still the same. However, we have new abilities or new proficiencies for each of our new technology types. There's heavy weaponry, firing big artillery cannons and tank turrets. There's heavy machinery, so driving tanks, flying rockets, flying fighters, flying airships. And there is robotics, so rewiring robots, but also using things like radios in order to cast spells and do other things. Those technologies, each class interacts with those technologies and performs those checks in using a combination of ability scores. So, for example, heavy machinery. To make a heavy machinery proficiency check, you average your strength and your constitution, and that's your modifier. So, and for robotics, it's I believe dexterity and intelligence are averaged. You know, you need if you're really smart but not very dexterous, you can still probably have a decent check. If you're really smart and very nimble fingered, then you're going to have a great check, a great modifier for those checks. But anyway, all of that is on the character sheet. It tells you which two you combine for these new proficiencies. Likewise, as you can imagine, and as you're painfully aware, Coxie, sometimes technology blows your nose off. And when technology goes haywire, when you suffer a malfunction, which is a big new mechanic in this setting, it's essentially a fumble charts for each type of technology. But you know, fumble charts don't really exist in 5e, but you know, we certainly didn't invent them. But we did create fumble charts for each of the types of technology. And when a piece of technology suffers a malfunction, you roll on the table, and some of them are fairly minor, and others are significant and result in the technology really playing up and continuing to malfunction or shutting down, in which case you need to repair it. So one of the new things in the setting is a repair kit, which is used to, it's a tool set, which is used to repair technology. And each class uses different attributes, different ability scores to affect their repairs. Rogues use their dexterity, fighters use their strength, I believe, and you know, just banging the thing back into place. And so that's another slightly new way that ability scores are used. And it's not always, in fact, in most cases, it's not the class's prime requisite ability score that is used for their ability check. It's usually something else that they have to use. Rogues are an exception, I believe, because they get to use their dex. But most of the others, you need something else in order to be good at repairmanship.
Just to make sure you're not just dumping all your points into one ability.
Right. But you never had to worry about Coxie, because you know you're 18s across the board.
Of course, I'm an absolute wizard at this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Now, leading from that, your proficiencies, the basic skill list that everyone's familiar with in D&D, I'm sure some of them have been swapped or changed or added. Like, nobody's using Arcana anymore. It's a thing of the past.
Arcana is right out. We excised it completely from this setting. And then we have the new skills or proficiencies, which are, as I said, the heavy machinery, heavy weaponry, robotics, and biofiddlery, which is how druids cast their spells. So we have a handful of new ones that, as I said, average ability scores to generate their modifiers.
Excellent.